Well, we've given you our top 5 teams in the country every single week, but here now at the end of the non-conference schedule, our definitive top 5 non-conference in the nation.
You are Locked On College Basketball, part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day.
What's up? Welcome into the Locked On College Basketball Podcast, the only national daily college hoop show out there. I'm your host, Isaac Shea. Joining me is our other host, Andy Patton, and it is great to be with you coming out of the Christmas holiday. Hope you enjoyed the Locked On Year in Review look back on Monday, but I know you are just as anxious as we are to get back to the college basketball content today. We've got some fun look ahead stuff at the conference portion of the schedule upcoming. We're going to give you our regular season conference champion picks. We're going to give you our biggest surprises and disappointments of the season. But first, we got to come at you with our top 5s. Andy and I are both at our normal house locations. He's in a condo. I'm in an Airbnb in Dallas, Texas. It's going to be a holiday miracle blast. Andy, great to be back together, buddy. Hit me with that top 5.
Yeah, absolutely, Isaac. Excited to be back recording. It's always fun to see the holiday games, even though there weren't a ton of super exciting ones this year. But I think that's all right. It's always good to spend time with family and take a few days off of college hoops. But we're back. We're here.
Right, yeah. The Big East force fed a game down our throats on Christmas Day for some silly reason in the midst of the NBA schedule and NFL Sunday. What are they doing? Anyway,
yeah, with you 100% on that. Yeah, top 5 teams. It's funny. It hasn't changed all that much, again, in part because the last week or so there haven't been a ton of high-profile games. We haven't seen a ton of action that really moved the needle too much for some of those big-name programs. I'm still looking at my top 5, and I think you have to start with UConn and Purdue. I think they're 2 of the 3 undefeated teams that are remaining in the country. We're going to talk a lot more about that third remaining team in a later segment here on today's show. But UConn and Purdue, top 2 teams in the country for me. I do think there's a reasonable argument to switch the order. For me, I'm still having UConn first. I don't think that they have done anything to not deserve that number 1 spot. They've just been fantastic all season long. Really balanced scoring attack, just a really, really deep, talented team that has continued to impress throughout the season and should continue to impress even, as they get more into the meat of their Big East Conference schedule. I think this is just a really, really solid program. Like I said, Purdue second, Zach Edey, of course, fantastic. The guards on that team have really stepped up and been phenomenal this year. I'm curious to see, we've seen them slip a little bit, have some kind of struggles in some of their regular season games, but by and large, I think this is still a really dangerous team, and they may not finish the season in the top 5 or even the top 10 if some things get a little haywire in conference play, but right now they deserve it. That's where they deserve to be right now. I rounded out with Houston and Kansas 3 and 4. Houston, again, obviously slipped a little bit with that loss to Alabama, but a really, really solid defensive squad, a team that I think is finding their way offensively. Terrence Arsenault has stepped up. Jarris Walker has been just incredible for that program. Yep. At Kansas, Bill Self, his program, they've been really good as well. I think they sometimes get a bit just under the radar, especially even as defending champs. They kind of get they're not getting as much media attention this year, but they're a really, really solid squad. And then I had a hard time with the top 5. I had those 4 were pretty much locked in, and I was ready to go. And I think there's about 4 or 5 different teams I'd be willing to put 5th. The team I landed on is Texas, and Texas is a really hard team to kind of pin down right now. Obviously, they have some significant off the court stuff going on with Chris Beard, and that is going to take a toll on the team. It took a toll on them in that game against Rice shortly after the news came out about his domestic violence situation. So that makes them a little bit trickier. I'm optimistic about Texas long-term, in part because I think that some of their young guys haven't even reached their full potential. Dylan Mitchell being a big part of that, obviously, for them. And I think there's still some room for potential growth for a team that has already looked fantastic this year. But I think there are some other really, like Arizona's right in that conversation for me. I think UCLA is right in that conversation. And I think Tennessee's right there too. I think there's 4 teams that kind of deserve the top 4, and then 4 other teams kind of vying for that 5th spot.
Oh yeah, man, that's great stuff, Andy. And mine is going to be very similar to yours. I've made a couple slight adjustments as I've had time to reflect during the celebration of the birth of our Lord and Savior Jesus Christ. And so I'll bring a couple things there. Number one, I'm right with you, keeping UConn at the top. I know that doesn't reflect the AP rankings,
Right.
but you and I both love this team so much.
Yeah.
I think part of why I stay so in on them is, for example, I'm bumping Purdue, I'll go ahead and say it, down to third this week.
Yeah.
Part of it is just the lack of depth behind Zach Edey,
Mhm.
which is part of why I love UConn, because behind Adama Sanogo is Donovan Clingan, this freshman who is just having a fantastic year. And so you just think about front court drop off if Sanogo goes to the bench with injury or foul trouble, and there's just not much drop off. And so that gives me a lot of faith in this Huskies team. I have decided to move Houston back into my number 2 slot through no fault of Purdue. It's just thinking about it and trying to not be a prisoner of the moment. That Houston-Bama game is a phenomenal mid-December college basketball game that I think does nothing to diminish what I still feel about Houston, who, by the way, is still number 1 at KenPom right now. And so I actually bumped Houston back up to number 2 this week. As I said, I've got Purdue number 3. In addition to me not being fully sold on like, hey, what happens to them if Zach Edey has any issues? Another thing is, as I think about that backcourt, they've been really solid, but they're heavily reliant on true freshman guards in Fletcher Lawyer and Braden Smith. And that, like, I was just thinking like, hey, as we get into Big Ten play, I'm a little concerned about that, honestly, and some of these other guards who might be able to exploit that. Not to mention the computers do not love Purdue as much as the human element. I believe they're 7th right now at KenPom, at least last time I checked. I've got Kansas in the exact same spot as you, number 4. What a story for Bill Self, losing so much off that national championship team. I don't know how many times I've said this college basketball season. They had to have a massive blow up from Jalen Wilson, and boy, has he done it. Absolutely.
He has been huge.
Right? Like, it's insane. But I think part, maybe even bigger than that for me, is I think Grady Dick was undervalued by recruiting services. He's been very consistent. And then look at that point guard position, man. Wagner might be the most undervalued true playmaking point guard in the nation. I just think they have all the right pieces to do what you need to do, both in Big 12 play and then going forward. So I've got them number 4. And then for some of the reasons you enumerated, I love Texas's roster. I just I've got a hold on them right now until we see how, you know, as you alluded to, more news came out this week from Chris Beard's fiance. So we'll just wait to see there. But I actually am keeping Arizona at number 5 this week. You talk again about front court depth. I like that. A little backcourt concern for me, but I think ultimately Kirk Kriisa can do the job necessary. And then as you do, I've got some other teams just outside that threshold. UCLA, actually, I'm a little bit higher on probably than a lot of people. They are one of only 2 teams in KenPom's top 11 in offensive and defensive efficiency, UConn being the other. UCLA is top 11 in both of those metrics. So I'm all in on them. And Alabama and Tennessee are another schools for me, just right outside that top grouping.
Yeah, I love the UCLA pick for sure. Jalen Clark has stepped up in a massive way for that team. Yeah, I'm excited to see what they can do for the rest of the year.
That I had been higher on that I'm actually going to start moving down a little bit is Arkansas. Not through any on-court things they've done, but Trevon Brazile, we know is out. And then now there's question marks, and Nick Smith is back out with injury. I'm just like, I was already concerned with Brazile being out, but man, if Nick Smith is not able to consistently be in this lineup this season, I don't know how they hold up in a strong SEC. And then another, and I know we both share this sentiment, and we might talk about it more later, but is Kentucky. Just guys that need to be big time aren't being big time. There's just a lot of concern I have for the Wildcats. So that's a couple teams I've moved down this week.
Well, you kind of touched on it perfectly, Isaac, as we get into the second segment here. But we're going to get into conference play. We got to take a look at which teams have been the biggest surprises this year, which teams have been the biggest disappointments. Again, kind of touched on a few of them right there. Before we get there, though, this episode of Locked On College Basketball is brought to you by LinkedIn. These days, every new potential hire can feel like a high-stakes wager for your small business. You want to be 100% certain that you have access to the best qualified candidates available. And that's why you have to check out LinkedIn Jobs. LinkedIn Jobs helps you find the right people for your team faster and for free. It's incredibly easy to create a free job post, so why not give it a try? Add your job in the purple hashtag hiring frame to your LinkedIn profile to spread the word that you're hiring. Simple tools like screening questions make it easy to focus on candidates with just the right skills and experience, so you can quickly prioritize who you'd like to interview and hire. You want to finish the year strong, and the right new hire can help you do just that. LinkedIn Jobs helps you find the qualified candidates you want to talk to faster. Post your job for free at linkedin.com/lockedoncollege. That's linkedin.com/lockedoncollege to post your job for free. Terms and conditions apply.
Don't forget those terms and conditions, Andy Patton. You got to keep those in mind.
Well, folks, for those of you who checked out our show on Monday, you saw that it was a year in review for the Locked On Sports Today podcast. So for your second listen today, you should check out the Locked On Sports Today podcast. It's fantastic. From the games that matter the most to the biggest stories in sports, go beyond the scoreboard and behind the scenes with local experts and insights that only Locked On can provide. Locked On Sports Today, available on YouTube and wherever you get podcasts. All right, Mr. Isaac Shade, we are talking surprises and disappointments. Obviously, it has been a bit of a wild year in college basketball when your number 1 and number 2 ranked teams in the preseason both fall out of the top 15 pretty early in the year. That is a pretty good indication that things have gone a little bit haywire. Your number 1 and number 2 teams, I believe, began the season unranked, or certainly at least outside of the top 20 for those 2 teams. Isaac, I want to start with you, and I want to hear who you have as your biggest surprise or surprise teams to start the season.
Well, yeah, to that point you just made, Andy, we've hit so much, and even on today's show already, about UConn and Purdue. It'd be silly for them not to be our biggest surprises, but we've already given them so much love that I want to point out another team. Another one that I clearly am very high on is Arizona, who started the year preseason in the teens. But I want to talk about a team that I don't believe I've talked about as a nice surprise, which is Jim Laranjega's Miami Hurricanes. The Hurricanes are all the way up to 14th in the nation this week. They're 12-1. They're 3-0 in the ACC. I believe the only 3-0 team in the ACC, because they're the only team that's played 3 games in the ACC. But got their biggest win of the season last week. They beat Virginia on their home floor. Isaiah Wong has been absolutely sensational. 17.2 points a game, 4.5 assists, and 1.8 steals. Nigel Pack, all that money he's getting, he's been okay. But when I stick in the backcourt, Jordan Miller has been better for me. Listen to this: 14.8 points, 6 rebounds, 1.9 assists, 1.3 steals. You love that, what it's bringing. But perhaps the one that is being most unsung is it can't just be the backcourt. And Miami's getting great play in the front court from Arkansas State transfer, Norchad Omier, who is at nearly averaging a double-double, 13.5 points, 9.8 rebounds, 1.4 blocks. And so just giving the Hurricanes a really, really nice floor balance and being able to do things that allow them to compete. And so for me, they have moved their way into that upper tier. For me, it's a top 4 right now in the ACC, along with the Hurricanes, also Virginia, North Carolina, and Duke. Their only loss is to Maryland on a neutral court. Yeah, listen, I'm not concerned about that at all. No bad losses so far for Miami. So really interested to see what they do moving into ACC play. Andy, what about you? Who is your biggest non-conference surprise so far?
Yeah, I think for me, we got to talk about the third and final undefeated team. We talked about UConn, we've talked about Purdue, and over the last week or so, we went from 11 or 10 teams left to 8 to 5, and now we're down to just 3 teams left that don't have a loss in the loss column. Of course, UConn, Purdue. Third up is the New Mexico Lobos in the Mountain West Conference. They are 12-0 this season. They are now ranked 22nd in the most recent AP poll. That is their first time being ranked since the 2013-2014 2014 season. It's been a decade since the last time New Mexico was a ranked team. And of course, this isn't a program that is like consistently always ranked, so it's not as shocking to see them, go a long period of time. But this is a team they weren't that great in the Mountain West last year. And so there wasn't a ton of optimism that this is a team that, I think there was some expectation that they would be better than they were last year. And certainly the Mountain West is a conference that tends to have one or two teams at the top and then about 5 or 6 teams kind of all mashed in the middle that kind of contend to be towards the top there. And New Mexico has really separated themselves in a tremendous way this season. I don't know that they are definitively the best team in the Mountain West from a pure talent perspective.
Sure.
But they're there right now. They're in that conversation. Obviously, San Diego State's in that conversation as well. We've seen UNLV very recently, one of the last remaining undefeated teams as well. But for this New Mexico squad, they got wins over St. Mary's, which is a great win, a win over San Francisco, who we were talking offline about their recent destruction of Arizona State. They have a win over Rick Pitino and Iona. They have a win over SMU. Not any incredible elite wins necessarily, but St. Mary's has been ranked at times this year. San Francisco picked up a vote in the AP poll this past week. They're not slouches by any stretch of the imagination. And for me, what I love about this New Mexico team is they had a lot of talent on last year's roster, and they managed to maintain said talent, which is not easy to do in the modern era. And then they've kind of just supplemented their roster with some more talent. They have 3 players who are currently averaging over 16 points per game. I didn't look up how many teams in the country have 3 players at over 16 per game, but I'm going to guess that it's not very many. That is a pretty unusual statistic to have. Jamal Mashburn is returning. Jamal Mashburn Jr., I should say, made me feel very old every time I see his name out there. Jalen House also returning. Those 2 guys were incredible last year. Big parts of what this program did. And again, they maintained both those guys. They didn't move on to Power 5 programs. And then they brought in Morris Udeze, who comes from Wichita State, grad transfer. He's their leading scorer. Those 3 guys absolutely killing it. And then they make a smaller addition, Josiah Alec from Kansas City. He's averaging about 9 points, 8.5 rebounds per game, a really good glass cleaner, 6'8" senior, tenacious rebounder. It's just like the perfect moves in the transfer portal to be able to keep the roster intact, add supplementary pieces around the guys that they already have in a conference like the Mountain West, where a lot of teams are fairly evenly split in terms of talent. There's not a huge discrepancy. That's how you go from 6th to 3rd, and 6th to 3rd in the Mountain West, puts you in line to be a tournament team. And now we're looking at a team that's undefeated, top 25 ranked program. This is a fantastic turnaround for New Mexico.
Big time. Love that for the Lobos. So Andy, now we turn our attention to some teams that we thought more highly of that have been some disappointments. I think, as you alluded to earlier in the show, we could have easily gone with Gonzaga or North Carolina here. However, both these teams have kind of rebounded at this point and are moving back up in the polls. And so for me, I've got to go with another team that was preseason top 10 that has had a much worse fate than either the Bulldogs or Tar Heels, and that is the Creighton Blue Jays, who after starting off 6-0 were preseason top 10, lost 6 in a row. Now, all 6 of those, no bad losses really, all to top 100 Ken Palm teams, but it's just once it started rolling, the snowball was going, and it's just hard for a team that preseason, I was saying, was the Big East preseason champion. We know, and it was but not Villanova. Well, that part's probably still true. It's just on. And so with Creighton, the computers still like them. They're 24th at Ken Palm. And I'm just for me, the issue is role definition. I feel there's too many they bring in Baylor Shireman, but there's just too many people trying to do that exact same thing. And so I think hopefully Coach McDermott is going to sit down, write out some New Year's resolutions, and figure out how to get some role definition for this team heading into Big East play. They start a stretch right now where they have 7 straight games against teams ranked in the Ken Palm top 80 as they really get into Big East play. And that kind of ends right at the end of January. So I'm really curious to see right now. Creighton's picked up 2 wins since that 6-game losing streak. So sitting at 8-6. Where are they after this 7-game streak? And I think we'll know a lot more about the Blue Jays come February, but they got to do some work in January to get back into the right side of the postseason conversation. What about you, Andy?
Yeah, Creighton's a great pick there, and I picked a team that I think has a bit of a similar vibe to that, and that is the Michigan Wolverines. I was initially going to go with Kentucky here, and we have talked about Kentucky and some of their struggles on this podcast a handful of times. And ultimately, when I was starting to look into Kentucky's resume, I was like, well, they got to win over Michigan, and then I was like, well, what about Michigan? Like, let's take a look at the Wolverines, and kind of, I remembered that they got beat quite badly by Arizona State early in the year, a loss that started to look like maybe it wasn't so bad of a loss. Now it looks like not as good of a loss. Either way, they got beat by 25 points, which is never, ever good. The other teams they lost to, by no stretch of the imagination are they bad. It is Virginia, it is Kentucky, it is North Carolina. So you can't punish them too heavily for having these decent losses on their schedule, but for a team that was expected to be in a top 20, top potentially 15 team in the country, to have the loss that stands out against Arizona State, the three other losses, just doesn't look great. They also struggled pretty mightily against Eastern Michigan. That was a really fun game where it looked like Damani Bates was going to single-handedly carry Eastern to a win over Michigan. Yeah. The team also struggled a bunch against Ohio. I think they only won that game by 4. They will single-digit victory over Lipscomb. So they've just had some real challenges. The Jalen Llewellyn injury really hurt them. And I think it's hard you don't want to bash a team for having a significant injury be a big part of what has versatile the team. Yeah. But at the end of the day, like, the depth hasn't stepped up, and maybe it will. The injury is still relatively fresh. They still got a lot of time to turn things around. But the issues with this team are not offensively. The issues with this team are defensively. They're a good shooting team. Hunter Dickinson has been Hunter Dickinson. Like, they're finding their way on that side of the ball, but Ken Pom has them 94th in the country defensively. If you want to be a top 25 team, top 20 team, if you want to compete for a conference championship, like you can't struggle that much on the defensive end of the floor. And we've seen some inconsistency on that side. We've seen them let other teams get really hot. Again, Arizona State dropped 87 on them earlier in the year. They're not generating a lot of turnovers. 5.5 steals per game is outside the top 300 in the country. That is not getting it done. If you're not getting steals, you're not getting takeaways. And then, of course, one of the things that seems to always down teams when you look at teams that are underperforming earlier in the year, free throw percentage. And Michigan has been really horrendous from the free throw line. As a team, they are shooting 67%, just under 67%, actually, just to twist the knife a little bit more there. 293rd in the country for Michigan. So you're looking at their schedule. They don't play, as of right now, they don't play another ranked opponent until January 26th. That is, Purdue. So that's going to be a pretty challenging one. But I think that's a little disingenuous when looking at their schedule. They also have Maryland and a road game at Michigan State, which is really difficult. A road game at Iowa. They play Maryland twice in that stretch of time, and Maryland, previously ranked opponent, obviously a good squad. Mixing Minnesota, Penn State, Central Michigan in there as well. So some opportunities to potentially move up and gain some big wins here. But by and large, this is a team that hasn't been what we wanted them to be early in the year. And with Llewellyn out, it's going to be tough for them to reach that threshold.
Yeah, we will have to keep our eyes on Juwan Howard's team. Jet, man, if his son Jet can get it really going and find some consistency, that would be massive. He is a big time player. Well, Andy, as we move into conference portion of the schedule, we want to make some picks now that we know a little bit more about these teams for our regular season conference champions. We're going to do that in just a moment. But first, this episode is brought to you by the NHTSA. Listen, you're hanging out with some friends. It's the holiday season. Everyone's putting back a few drinks. A few become a few too many. As the evening comes to an end and people start to head out, you think, you know what? I could call for a ride, but I live pretty close nearby. I'll be fine. It's no big deal. What are the odds I'm going to get pulled over anyway? And even if I do, what's the worst that can happen? My insurance goes up, or I lose my license, or I could lose my job, or total my car, or worse yet, kill someone. Everyone knows about the risks of driving drunk. The results are tragic and often deadly. However, that still doesn't stop everyone from getting behind the wheel while under the influence. That's why police officers are out on the roads right now looking for impaired drivers to save lives. So if you think it's okay to drive after a few drinks, please think again. Play it safe and plan ahead to get a ride. It only takes one mistake to change your life or someone else's forever. Drive sober or get pulled over. So as we move into the new year in just a few days and the big kickoff to the conference portion of the schedule, what Andy and I want to do is give you our picks for the regular season champion for the Power 5 conferences as well as the Big East. We're just going to take these in alphabetical order, starting with the ACC and then going to the Big 12. I know T comes after E of Big East, but you know what? It's the numeral 12. It's not spelled out. That's why it works that way. Andy, who do you have in the Atlantic Coast Conference?
Yeah, for me, it's a 4-team race. I think probably more like a 3-team race, potentially. I'm not quite sure, as much as Miami has been an impressive team this year. I'm not quite sure that they're in that conversation just over the course of the full ACC slate. So for me, it's going to really come down to, of course, the two of the teams that it often comes down to, Duke and North Carolina. And then, of course, Virginia ends up being in that conversation as well. I think the biggest factor is really how Duke's freshmen, who have been, Kyle Filipowski's been great. Other than that, they've had some issues there. If those guys can kind of step up and become who Duke freshmen often end up becoming, then I think Duke's probably your favorite there. But I'm going to take Virginia. I think that Tony Bennett's done a fantastic job with the squad that he has this year. And ultimately, I think that they're the best team in the conference. But it's going to be a tough one with a couple teams at the top there.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm with you. Miami, I think they are top 4. They're going to be one of those ACC double buys for the conference tournament. I just don't think they have the talent right now to compete with those top 3. I think that's a great call on your part. For me, until Derek Whitehead and Derek Lively start being what they need to be, I just don't see it for Duke, especially in John Shire's first year over the course of a regular season anyway. Conference tournament, absolutely, I would buy on them, but not over the course of the regular season. I don't think Mr. Roach is a talented enough guard to do it. If it was still the Roy Williams era, I would actually pick Virginia over North Carolina, but in Hubert Davis's first year, at the helm for the Tar Heels, they kind of throttled Virginia in both regular season matchups. And so for that reason, and with the experience of this team, interestingly, Hubert Davis put Leaky Black on Kihei Clark in those games, which is pretty funny to see 6'9" on like 5'10". But it completely took Virginia out of their game. Reese Beekman is a little banged up right now. And so until he's healthy, I'm not sure Virginia's at full strength. So as of right now, I'm going to go ahead and stick with my preseason projection of the Tar Heels. Andy, Big 12.
Yeah, Big 12 is such a dynamic, such a fun conference. There's so many options that it could be here. Like, it's weird to be looking at the notes and like we're not even talking about Baylor. And it's like Baylor is a team that like should be in this conversation and does deserve to be to an extent in this conversation. But there's just so much talent at the top of the Big 12. I'm still sticking with Kansas. Bill Self seems to find ways to win the Big 12 nearly every single season. Of course, they're the defending champions. You mentioned Grady Dick earlier and the job that he has done as a true freshman. We talked about Jalen Wilson and the kind of glow up that he has had in a much needed season for them. I think it's going to be a gauntlet this year. I think certainly Texas is going to be a huge issue. And we talked a little bit about what's going on with them right now and how that could impact them potentially. TCU in that conversation as well. And of course, Baylor, I think they still have some issues they need to figure out in the front court. They're not getting a lot of scoring in the front court. The back court is being relied on a little bit too heavily, but I think all those teams have just enough warts that I'm going to lean towards Kansas, but I'm not going to pretend this is the one I'm the most confident about.
Yeah, I'm with you. I enumerated all the reasons I believe in Kansas earlier. I'm going to go with them. If Texas gets things figured out with Chris Beard, I'm in on that. TCU, as you said, is kind of coming back from some of those early season issues, some injury things getting healed up. And I really believe in that Baylor backcourt. Probably, I've said all season, the best 3-guard lineup in the nation. They really need front court help. Maybe Jonathan Chama-Chachua can get back and be ready to help them out long-term. But right now, for me, it's still very much Kansas. Oh, moving on to the Big East. Like, I don't even know if we need to spend time on this one, Andy, because I think we could just go, hey, 1, 2, 3.
Yep.
UConn, right? Like, there we go. And so let's move right on to the Big Ten. Andy, who you got?
Yeah, Big Ten is much more difficult.
This is the hardest one for me. Yeah,
it's the hardest one for me too, because I'm not that confident in Purdue. I think that they're the pick right now. Obviously, they're undefeated. They've beat some really good teams. Zach Edey's playing like the best player in college basketball. We kind of alluded earlier in the conversation to some of the issues with consistency from their guards and the youth of some of their guards and what happens if Zach Edey's not on the floor. And yeah, he played, he's been playing 30-ish minutes per game this year, but that wasn't the case last year. If there's any kind of, issue with that going forward,
there's no Travion Williams.
Exactly. No Travion Williams is an issue for them. But looking at some of the other teams, I'm like, yeah, Ohio State, I think they make sense as the pick. I think they're the second best team right now. Ken Pom has them second. I'm not in love with what they're bringing to the table either. I think they're good. I think they're fine, but I don't necessarily think they're better than Purdue. Indiana, I'm a little concerned about some of the injury stuff with them, how Hood Schifino, what he's been able to do. Trace Jackson Davis has been, of course, very, very good, but can he carry a team to a Big Ten conference championship without some of those secondary pieces? Probably not. I weirdly kind of like Wisconsin as a bit of a dark horse pick here, but I'm not picking them to win it. That's not my actual prediction.
Sure.
They could be a significant spoiler. And honestly, it wouldn't shock me. It wouldn't completely stun me if Chucky Hedburn somehow just carried that team all the way to a Big Ten championship. I'm going to say Purdue, but again, I don't feel exceptionally confident in that either.
Yeah, I think that's the thing is preseason, it felt like the Big Ten had no elite teams. Mm-hmm. And then maybe they did. Now I'm back out on that again. I think it's all like a bunch of like 15 to 40-ish teams. If we're talking national level, everything you just said, I'm with you. I'm going to go with Ohio State as my pick. Zed Key is an underrated, undersized big. I love freshman Bryce Sensabaugh. You folks, keep your eyes on this kid. He is phenomenal. And so I'm actually going to go with the Buckeyes as my pick. Andy, heading out to the West Coast Pac-12.
For me, I'm taking Arizona. It's between Arizona and UCLA. Those are the two teams that it's between. There's not really a strong third team right now. Arizona State looked like they might kind of be in that conversation, but I don't know that they were ever realistically going to compete with either of those two teams. Oregon has had significant injury issues. They've also had underperformance issues with a handful of their veteran guys. So for me, it's down to Arizona, UCLA. I would pick those two over the field. Tremendous landslide, yes. To be quite honest. But I'm taking Arizona, and I think it's really close. Jaime Jaquez is fantastic. Again, we mentioned Jalen Clark has stepped up in a big way. They don't really have the front court to compete with Arizona's front court. Right. Azuolas Tubelis has been fantastic. Umar Ballo has been a really, really nice piece for Tommy Lloyd's squad. And the guard play is a bit of an issue. Courtney Ramey hasn't quite assimilated as well as I think there was some hope that he would. Kirk Risa has been inconsistent, but I think that guard play is going to get better, and I'm not as confident about UCLA's front court, although they have some really young pieces there as well. So it's going to be a really good battle between those two teams, but I'm taking Arizona.
Yeah, I mean, it's the same thing. I'm right with you. If, for example, you talked about the youth of UCLA, like if Amari Bailey can get going, maybe so, right, for Mick Cronin's team, but I think here's what's going to be interesting. It's not about how they perform against each other. It's do both of these teams consistently take care of business against the rest of the conference who's not good, frankly. Right. And so it's like basically like you got to perform against the teams you're supposed to beat and split against the other top two team. And I think whoever is more consistent in that way is the team that comes out with it. And for me, that's the Arizona Wildcats. Just what Tommy Lloyd has done these first 2 years is nothing short of insane. The McHale Center is a great home court advantage for them. Yep. And I'm with you. I think they take it away. SEC, Andy, for me, this is the second hardest one to pick behind the Big Ten.
Yeah, I'm looking at Ken Pom right now, and I'm kind of thinking about the top teams here, trying to think about this. And there's 4 or 5 different teams I think you could reasonably make an argument for here. The team that is fourth in Ken Pom right now is the Alabama Crimson Tide. I think that they're maybe going to be my pick here. It's between two teams for me. It's either Alabama or Tennessee.
Yeah, same.
It's odd that it's not Kentucky. Obviously, Kentucky, fantastic program. They've had some significant issues this year offensively, and maybe they'll find their rhythm. They'll have a really nice conference season. I could see that, but I can't pick them to win right now. Arkansas obviously dealing with some significant injuries. Auburn has always been a little bit more of a pretender. Sorry to our fearless leader, Zach Blackerby, but I'm not sure I believe them necessarily in this conversation. But for me, it's Tennessee and it's Alabama, and I think I'm going to take Tennessee, but it's really close between those two teams.
I like it. Yeah, it's been cool to see some of these Mississippi State and Alabama, or excuse me, Auburn, as you said, go undefeated for so long. I think it's a little bit of fool's gold with both of those teams. I'm with you. It's weird to not have Kentucky in the top two. There just hasn't been enough growth. If they can do that, and it's not because of youth like normal with Kentucky. That's the other weird thing. It's like the veterans aren't taking the steps they need to. With Arkansas, I said this earlier, I would be in on them, but just the injury stuff. And so it comes down to Tennessee and Alabama for me. I'm leaning the other way from you. I haven't seen Tennessee do enough consistently offensively early this year. I need to see more consistently from Vescovi, right? And those kind of things. So if Phillips, the great freshman, if he can really, really do it, but for me, it's Alabama. There's always the question of the up and down with 3-point shooting, but their defense is back to a high level this year. And so I'm all in on Nate Oates squads. I love Mr. Miller, that sensational freshman right now. I wouldn't be surprised if he is our national freshman of the year. Give me the Crimson Tide to win the SEC.
Love it. I think it's a great pick. I think it's going to be a nice battle between those two teams and really a handful of teams in the SEC. Well, Isaac, we are done with the mostly done with the non-conference schedule. We're getting into conference play. It's a really exciting time in the college basketball season. I want to thank all of you who have made Locked On College Basketball your first listen of the day today. For your second listen, again, check out the Locked On Sports Today podcast. It's the biggest stories of the day, plus instant reactions, big game recaps, and the take of the day. It is available on the Odyssey app, YouTube, and wherever you get podcasts. That is also where you can find the Locked On College Basketball podcast. If you have not found us on YouTube, just go to YouTube, search Locked On College Basketball, hit that big red subscribe button. It is very much appreciated. We got a ton more great content coming your way this week, so check it out all here. For now, peace out.